The first premise is that the world's a big place and it is a world of finite resources. We're not making any more land. There are some people in Hong Kong building little islands, but that doesn't really count. We're not making any more water. There's been a few experiments over the years to try and create water, but we're not really creating any more of it. And with two small exceptions, we live in a closed system. One of those exceptions is the amount of energy that we receive. The Earth gets hit by more energy in the form of solar radiation than we use as a species every day. The other thing, which isn't really finite, is data. Now, I'm going to come back to this because obviously that's what the talk is about. But data in itself isn't that useful. Information is what's useful. Human beings make decisions on information. And there's an information theoretic statement which goes along the lines of information is deemed to have occurred when something happens that you didn't expect. If something happens that you completely expected, there's no information in it. Unfortunately, what we tend to do as human beings is take everything and then make data out of it. So you can have data which actually has no information in it whatsoever. And there is no known limit on how much data we can actually create. There's no known limit on how much data we could utilize. And the fact that storage continues or grows at, roughly speaking, 10 times the rate of compute power, and compute power grows at, roughly speaking, 10 times the rate of communications, the thing that's going to win is data. So, bear with me on this premise and I'll try and work it through a little more. The other thing that we know in a finite system is that we have a growing population. We're 7 billion people now. We expect to be 8 billion people in 2025. We expect to be nearly 9 billion people in 2050, which is actually not that far from now. And when we look around the world and we look at this growing population, we know that things aren't evenly distributed. We have, roughly speaking, a quarter of the population who lives below the poverty line, which is quite a step up from just 15 years ago when it was closer to 50%. 33% of people live in urban slums. We are, at this point in our time, the most urbanised we've ever been, ever. More people live in cities than have ever lived in cities before. A greater proportion of the population lives in cities than ever before. But 1 in 3 lives in an urban slum. And roughly speaking, a sixth of the world doesn't get enough calorific intake. A sixth of the world is hungry. And that corresponds to more than 1 billion people. When we take a closer look at our own home, when we look at Australia, what we see is that we've always thought of ourselves as a society or an economy based on mining and agriculture. We're a dig it up and ship it economy or a shear it, shoot it, ship it economy. And certainly we think of ourselves in our rustic background as being swaggies stuffing sheep into tucker bags as opposed to people writing software or people doing big data and analytics. But in practice, we're not. In practice, we're a services economy. Nearly 75% of our GDP is services, and nearly 75% of the population or the workforce works in services. And the challenge, of course, is we're not very good at it. Apart from financial services and mining, we actually have a pretty poor track record in terms of productivity in the services space. So there's room for improvement. Looking much, much more closely, when we think about ourselves, we're all living longer, which is great. But we're all retiring at roughly the same age. Certainly the new federal government has given us some nudges in the direction of retiring at a slightly later age. But the reality is that we're rapidly outstripping the period of being in retirement compared to the working age than any other time in our history. Every day you live, statistically, every day you live, you'll get an extra 4 hours. And that rate of longevity of ageing is actually increasing. A lot of people have been talking about how do we deal with the Generation X and the Millennials, how do we sell to them, how do we engage them, how do we do this, how do we do that. In practice, our population is becoming much more grey-haired, much more white-haired. We're facing what's known as a silver tsunami of people who are moving to the post-retirement age, post-60, post-70. And that comes with some pretty serious challenges. More people are living with chronic disease. More people are living with cognitive impairment. And many, many more of our population are living in the post-retirement period as opposed to the current retirement period. At the moment, it's roughly speaking 1 retired person for 5 people in the workforce. Mid-century, that's expected to be 1 person retirement for 2.5 people in the workforce. So there are some pretty significant challenges facing the planet, our country, and also there's some pretty significant changes in terms of how we think about health, ageing, retirement. And it also costs a lot more to support people who are living with chronic disease, living to be much older. And at the moment, taking out defence, health is the single biggest budget item for every government. It's estimated at the moment we spend 20 cents, or the government spends 20 cents out of every single revenue dollar raised, state, federal, local, when you aggregate. And that's expected to grow to 40 cents out of every single revenue dollar raised by 2043. But at a state level, that means that every dollar raised for every state goes into health. And that has one glorious advantage, of course, and that's simplification of government. You only need a health minister. There's no money for anything else. So we've got some challenges, and we've got some macro, some mega trends from a global perspective, from a national perspective, and just from a societal perspective that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about what we can do. And I want to come back to this point about data. We've got lots of it. Everybody's got lots of it. And every projection that's ever been made by any company about the rate of growth of data stored or transmitted or communicated on the internet or stored anywhere has been wrong. And it's been wrong because it's far more than anyone dared guess. So the question then is, so what? What do you do with this data? And the basic premise is that data isn't useful. It's information which is useful. So what you need to do is be able to get your data in some sort of digital form and then link it, bring it together, clean it up, serve it up, and then start doing much, much more useful things at the information layer. Then you can do some things which provide real insight. You can model what's going on, you can visualize what's going on, you can get deeper insight at the wetware level. Something comes up in front of you, you can see trends, you can see pictures, you can see what's happening. Or you can do some really, really powerful things and then start to automate that process, taking insight into analysing, modelling, or optimising. And then you can do something even more powerful, and that's start to do things with that data in an automated way. You can configure things, you can adapt things, you can heal things, you can change things. But you can do that at the information layer. It also means, in practice, we can ask questions about the world that we've never been able to ask before. We can actually know things about the world in any domain. Once we've got data, we can know things about the world, about us as people, about our economy, about the country, about the planet, about the universe. We can know things that we've never known before because we can ask really, really insightful questions. Every single aspect of research has shown that the deeper you dig, the more data that you get access to, the more you can bring that together in a useful and meaningful way, the more you can know. And it's a fundamental tenet of science that there is no guaranteed bottom where we will absolutely know everything about any topic at all. The more data you can bring, the more information you can bring, the more you can know. And that's pretty exciting. And that's applicable everywhere. About our economy, about us as people, about our planet, about the universe. The more data we can get our hands on, the bigger hammer we've got, the sharper scalpel we've got to know more about what's going on. And the richer we can make those data sets, the more we can bring what seems to be largely irrelevant data sets to bear and make them relevant to the problem we're addressing, the more likely we can actually get some insight. That's the fundamental premise. The other critical point is that we're in a point in our history that we've never been in before. There are more and more data sets being made available. All governments all around the world are making data available. There's been some real hesitancy in Australia to make those data sets available, but in the UK and the US in particular, they've been making huge amounts of data available. But they're typically things like bus timetables, locations of toilets, some of the services which are carried out by government, but not the really, really valuable data sets, not the transactional data sets which engage directly with people. If you look at data.gov.au, you will actually find the location of every single public toilet in Australia, which could be very useful, but it's hard to see how you generate a lot of value out of that. But the data is coming, and it's slowly but surely being released more and more frequently with higher and higher quality. What makes that data useful is when you can link it together. So linked open data is a concept which is being championed by the inventor of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, and there's a community out in the larger world who are demonstrating the value of consistently linking to data sets which are made available. So even if the data changes, even if the data gets moved somewhere else, you've still got a link to it. So you've got a platform that you can start to build on. All of us are also creating an incredible digital footprint with our mobile phones, with our devices. We tweet, we Facebook, we LinkedIn, we do all the things that we do to express ourselves in a digital environment. And much of that data is available for anybody. You can buy a feed from Twitter. You can buy a little bit, you can buy the hose pipe, you can buy the fire hydrant from Twitter, but you've got access to that. And there are some pretty amazing things you can get just by watching what people are tweeting. A completely different concept of sentiment analysis at an individual level about a stock, about a portfolio, about a service, about a piece of infrastructure, about a country. I saw some great work recently where some people did a whole of analysis of all the countries around the world based on Twitter feeds to try and determine who was the happiest, who was the most paranoid, and what sorts of things people worried about. You should have seen the results around the last federal election around a year ago. We in Australia were both the happiest and the most paranoid nation for a couple of weeks. The other big thing is cloud services. That's really provided a lot of computational ability to do things like take global data sets and make them relevant, to throw the analytics at the problem. And there was a huge debate for years and years and years about cloud services. Should we use cloud? Is it safe? And in practice, cloud has just come. I'm sure every single one of you has used a cloud-based service this week, and whether you know it or not, you're using cloud and you will almost certainly use cloud from here on in. So this is what changes things. In the past, data was a problem, it was a headache. Now it can be really powerful because we've got some structure, some power, we've got some compute, we've got analytics, which we're starting to see the benefit of. But unfortunately, there's a lot of really valuable data which is still paper-based. And there's a whole lot of reasons why that's the case, typically historical. But there's a lot of valuable data sets which are either locked up and you can't get them, so unable to make them available in digital form, or unwilling to make them available in digital form because there's a whole lot of things that happen. Data starts to live, data gets liberated when it goes in a digital format, provided you can do things with it. So a lot of people ask the question, what do I do with this data? What do I do with it? How can I generate some value out of our data? And the way to look at this question is actually to turn it completely on its head. You need to have a question. And there's a few examples I'll show you where people have been bold enough to ask a question which really adds value. Why do people buy my product? Why don't people buy my product? Why do people leave my fund? Why do people churn out of my network? There are some really fundamental questions which some of them may be answerable, some of them may not. But the idea is if you've got a question which is answerable, then you can bring some pretty powerful analytics to answer that question. An example of an answerable question is this person likely to come to this conference again next year? That's an answerable question. What's not answerable is, will this person come to this conference next year? So the certainty you can't have, but a probabilistic approach to how likely is that person to buy a toaster in a year's time, to churn to another fund in a year's time, to churn out of a network. Those sorts of things you can actually know. You can know it at a group level, you can know it at an individual level. But if you've got a question which is answerable, then you're off to a very good start. If you've got a question which is not answerable, then you can broaden the question a little bit and talk about something which is likely. Then comes the analytics. So on top of our data stack on the previous slide, I showed that little thin layer, which is really where the power comes to this whole area. The analytics is what makes the data powerful. Some of those analytics are things like just visualizing. If you had a view of all of your customers and what they were doing, what their spend rates were, what their propensity to leave was, if you could just visualize that, that's pretty powerful. That still requires you to make decisions in what we call wetware, but that's a pretty powerful thing. Visualize, monitor, detect, report. It's very, very useful stuff. If ever you've watched some sort of, or been in an operations center and watched some real-time graphs coming along, that's the sort of thing that still requires you as a person to make decisions, but it gives you really powerful insight, which you can then act on. The next box along, the red box, is the model, analyze, optimize, and this is where you get to play what-if scenarios. So the data has come to you, you've got something which is useful, you're back in the information layer, and you can now say, what if this happens? Which is not quite the same question as, will that individual buy my product? But you can ask questions like, what if I change this? What does that do to the population of people interested in remaining part of my fund or part of my network? And then you can do some optimization around that. And what's interesting is the subtlety with which you can bring those examples to bear. The last one is doing something about it. And of course, that's when you get to crunch the big data. So if you're working backwards from a question and you've got some sort of way of reducing that question, of the data you've got to answering that question, then the data sets you've got make it a much more powerful process. If you had the most valuable data and the clearest possible question, you'd have a really, really powerful way of getting to the answer to that question. If you don't have the data you need, but you've got data around it, then you can do a whole lot of inference about what that most valuable data set actually is. And you can do a lot to get yourself towards that question, answering that question. But I'll try and give you some examples of what I actually mean. Very first point, a whole lot of people think that this is the data that they've got. And there are a whole lot of reasons why that data just doesn't become available. If you went to whoever is the custodian of your data, custodian of your records, and say, please give me this data in a form that I could make useful, the answer will almost certainly be no. And there's three real reasons for that. One is unwilling, one is unable, one is not allowed. The not allowed one, it depends on the data set that you're after. If it's a data set from government, then there's policy and regulation around it, which sometimes needs to be clarified as to getting that data out. If it's your own department, it might be that it's an internal policy, you're not allowed to release it, it could be problematic. So there's a whole lot of reasons which need to be addressed around the not allowed, but they're mostly around rules making. The unable is what's reflected here. It's expensive to get the data into electronic form, to liberate it, to make it useful. But that's really time and money. What's often really, really interesting is the unwilling, and that's ultimately cultural. Because if someone releases their data, there's a loss of control. There's potential that it shows something really bad about the department or the group who are using that data. And there's always the statement that what happens if there's an unintended consequence of releasing that data. Now, if you're talking about your own data of your own members in your own company or your own organisation, that's one thing. But if what you're trying to do is link together lots and lots of different data sets from all over the place to gain that deeper insight, this starts to become a challenge. Most of it's cultural, but I'm not going to give you the answer to it. I'm just going to highlight the fact that I recognise it's a problem. But if you can digitise, if you can get that data into a form which is useful, then you can do some powerful things, and that starts you on the journey for creating real insight. And I wanted to use an example here of something completely out of the domain that we work in here, and that's bringing the physical world into the virtual world. These are some guys at CSIRO who invented a spinning laser, this little thing called Zebedee, which, if any of you are old enough to remember the Magic Roundabout, the thing on the spring with the mustache, that was Zebedee. So this is also Zebedee. It works if you look up YouTube CSIRO Zebedee, you'll see this thing. These guys are creating virtual models of the world. They walk around, paint the environment, and produce a point cloud with sub-centimetre accuracy. But what it means is that you can bring anything into the digital world. And one of my main points is that everything can be digitised and everything will be subject to deeper analytics. So some of the really cool examples of what these guys were doing, they produced a virtual model of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. We sent a young researcher over to Pisa and he ran up and down the stairs of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, 8 minutes, did some outside, so got some views from the outside and produced a 3D model of the Leaning Tower of Pisa in approximately 8 minutes with centimetre accuracy. Absolutely phenomenal. And now what you can do is you can twist it and stretch it and rotate it and distort it. You can watch how it's falling over or how its inclination is changing every year. But it means that you can bring something really, really interesting into the virtual world, into the digital world. The guys also spent some time with a big US aircraft manufacturer who makes 747s over in Seattle, and wandered around on the factory floor waving this thing around and looked at just building models of 747s. And in particular, they looked at the undercarriage and looked at as built versus as planned, and just do a simple delta on it. In a complex system like that, you're really interested as to how well it matches the design. Anything can be brought into the digital world. Everything is virtualizable. Then, of course, you start to link things together, and that's where it becomes really interesting. There's probably the biggest example of linking really disparate data sets together at an economy-wide scale is happening in Tasmania in a project called Sense-T, where in practice, starting with agriculture, with every single farm that's linked as part of this project, initially 21 farms, but we're looking at what happens when you sensorize a farm, what happens when you pull information in, pull data in from grapes, from oysters, from finfish, from intensive horticulture, from veggie growing. Can you start to treat the farm as a factory? Can you remove a whole lot of the ambiguity or the uncertainty associated with farming and start to treat the farm as a factory? And the answer is, yes, you can. The use cases are really quite simple, and that's looking at the factors of production, and that's water and fertilizer use. So that's the goal that's being set here. But if a farmer has real-time, reliable, high-quality information coming in from a very dense sensor network, and in this case the sensors are about 1/25th of what historical sensors have cost, so you can put 100 times as many of these sensors on your farm. Can you start to treat the farm as a factory? Can you start to look at the factors of production to lower the cost of production and detect things like frost or botrytis striking your grape type? And the answer is yes, you can. But what's really amazing is the guys growing grapes and the guys harvesting oysters, not only do they get a benefit out of this, but they can actually cross-inform each other. When there's a rain event near an oyster farm, they have to shut down. The regulator says you have to shut the farm down for 3 days. And that's just a hard and fast rule because we need to be protected from a potential runoff event which impacts oysters. But if the regulator knows that there's sensors out there that can predict when the water is going to actually strike the farm from a rain event, then first of all, the farmer's got some warning about that shutdown happening. But when the regulator knows that water is running through a farm which hasn't been sprayed for pesticides because they've been able to sensorize their network, they've actually got a much stronger case for narrowing that window of cease to harvest. Or, if they know it's running through a farm which has been sprayed, then they've got an argument for actually having a wider window for that cease to harvest. So these use cases actually cross-inform each other. But what's really cool is when you develop a really new data set. In this case, we developed a sensor for the oyster heartbeat. Who knew? But a sensor for the oyster heartbeat which tells you how the oyster itself is feeling. So we're bringing in a completely different sort of data set. And the oyster is saying, well, actually, I'm fine. I'm really just quite enjoying myself. I'm sitting here, I'm feeding, my mouth's open, I'm gaping, I'm feeding this. I'm having a blast. I'm an oyster's idea of heaven. That use case, that extra bit of information means that you know to the minute how the oyster's feeling, and you can feed that back to the regulator and say, now is the time you have to cease harvesting, or actually the oysters are doing just fine. Bringing a variety of data, bringing the variety in, as well as the volume and velocity, is what makes a difference. But there's more. This is an example from the good folks at CSIRO, and that's actually trying to understand the healthcare system. We spend in Australia almost $130 billion per annum recurring expenses on the healthcare system, which means that that's a huge amount of money and growing at something like 12% per annum. And part of the challenge is that the healthcare system is incredibly complex. There are so many different stakeholders, so many different business cases, so many people living to be older and living with chronic disease. It's really difficult to know who's in charge of the healthcare system. There are so many state, federal and local government interconnects, so many suppliers, vendors, GPs, hospitals themselves. There's a really, really large number of different business cases, a really large number of different drivers, and it's absolutely impossible to tell who's in charge. It may be possible that no one's in charge of the healthcare system. That may be why the dollar figure is going up all the time. Don't tell anyone I said that, but I suspect no one's actually in charge. But what you can do is you can start to measure things inside a hospital. Just take the acute care, so just the hospital itself. Look at what's happening. Look at what drives admissions, look at what drives what's happening inside the hospital, and then start to model that, and then start to analyse it. And long story short, what CSIRO was able to do is predict who's going to walk in the door of the emergency department in 4-hour blocks. Today, tomorrow, next Tuesday, next month, next year. By not only measuring what's going on inside the hospital, but by bringing in a lot of outside information. What's happening in the local community? Is there a full moon? What's the temperature prediction going to be? What's the pollen count prediction going to be? Is it schoolies week? All of these things go into the model and it spits out an answer. These are the type of injuries that are going to happen this afternoon. These are the type of injuries to expect next Tuesday. And the accuracy of this is so good that they're able to take the number of beds which are held aside for the emergency arrivals down by a factor of 3. So improved prediction capability by a factor of 75%, if that maths works out. And those beds get freed up to be used for elective surgeries. A bed costs $1 million to buy, $500,000 a year to run. It's $1,300 worth of value every day that bed's released. There's no such thing as savings in health, you just move the value around. But that's prediction at a group level. It doesn't say that person, Grandma Smith, will come in with a wrist injury. It says someone will come in with a wrist injury. When you try and do things at an individual level, it becomes much more subtle. This is an example from the Department of Human Services. DHS receives more than 3,500 calls an hour. During that time, people lose their jobs, they suffer a death in the family, and or become separated. There's lots of things that happen in our lives. And DHS are a group of very, very caring people, and they get hit by 3,500 calls per hour. And these impacts are not only damaging for the individuals, they're very, very expensive. And can lead to some pretty significant trigger points where people then start to slide. Now, DHS has a pretty good handle on those who are doing well, those who really aren't doing well, but they would really like to know what's happening to those people who are sliding, or identify those people who are sliding and intervene. And there are good economic reasons for doing that, because someone who's sliding down, either from an emotional perspective or a socio-economic perspective, starts to have serious problems engaging with telephone companies, people who supply gas and electricity, and those companies will spend a lot of time trying to recover costs from someone who's not paying their bills, credit card companies. And at some point, give up and just go into a debt relief mode or a forgiveness mode, but that happens after quite a long struggle, and a lot of expense has been incurred to try and recover the debt. And of course, there's all the sorts of impacts for the individual themselves. Knowing about it earlier and being able to intervene would make a very significant difference for the individual and for all the people who provide services to that individual. And there are ways to do it. DHS has so many touch points in terms of not only the direct interaction with people, but also things which are publicly available. Social media is one example. Emails that have been sent backwards and forward to Department of Human Services, what's happening with account closures. And the amazing thing about DHS is they have all the data that would make all the difference, but they're not allowed to link it together. They're prohibited from linking it together for privacy reasons, for all sorts of long-standing reasons. So they could do it themselves if they could, but they can't. So they look around that. They look around the person and try to create a data shadow. And as I mentioned before, if you don't have the most valuable data, but you've got data around it, you can start to infer or you can start to predict based on that. But it's a very, very subtle process. It's exactly what happens when we are targeted with individualised marketing. There's a whole lot of information from a lot of different areas which are brought together, which makes it much, much more directly applicable to us. But it requires the data, requires those pretty sophisticated levels of modelling, and then some prediction. I think the last example I'll give in this space is optimisation. I mean, once you've got all that data available to you, what can you do with it? Now, okay, this is that same big aircraft manufacturer in Seattle in the US. Let's call them Boeing for the sake of argument. Boeing's a 100-year-old company. They know what they're doing. They are a really lean, agile, very efficient company. They know how to do their demand forecasting, they know how to do their strategic planning, they know they've got a backlog of aircraft, and their only mission in life is to try and get those planes through faster. But it's very difficult to squeeze more of what you've got. In any domain, you do the arms race, you become more efficient, you become more lean, and where else do you go? And in Boeing's case, they've got a back order which is just unbelievable in terms of aircraft. But where do you go? If you've squeezed every last drop out of things, where do you go to get that extra efficiency? And the answer is you cast a much wider net and start to look at things which aren't supposed to happen. And in this case, looking at car crash rates, anomalies in signals, so in the signalling process when things were going wrong, rescheduling of resources, and in some cases, what happens when you include the maintenance process in. Plane goes out, goes for test flight, comes back in, adjust this widget, adjust that thing. Taking a much, much broader net and looking at lots of different data sets beyond the obvious ones that you've already addressed. And in this case, it was possible to squeeze a bit more out of that production process, just a couple of percent. But when you've got nearly $1 trillion worth of backorder, a couple of percent makes a difference. So, let's move specifically to financial services. That's actually a photo of my desk, and so please no disparaging remarks about the poor lady in the photograph. Applying big data in financial services, are you crazy? There's a whole lot of reasons why it's just impossible. There's all of the pressures associated with you've already got challenges with delivering more services, minimizing risk, personalizing offers. You've got customers who aren't loyal anymore and quite prepared to jump over to someone else. You've got changing needs, you've got much more complex requirements. How do you protect privacy if you start linking things together? What are the unintended consequences? There are a whole lot of reasons why you just can't do this. It's impossible. We may as well give up. The truth of the matter, of course, is that's not the case. Otherwise I wouldn't be standing here talking to you. The truth of the matter is that you can do some things about it which allows you to really generate some benefit and think of things in a different sort of way. Once upon a time, we would, if we tried to bring in a big ICT project, we'd bring our data analytics, our compute into play, and we'd throw a whole big problem at it. We'd specify, and we'd get something which typically didn't deliver what we expected. The approach which you can take now is to really focus on where you add the greatest value. Focus on your data sets that you can bring, your analytics that you can bring, and then try to create value out of that by opening up to innovation. One of the points that we discovered, one of the greatest aspects of the Apple business model, the Apple App Store, is that you don't have to do everything. You create a platform, you make sure that your data, or what you provide, is well constructed, operates according to a set of rules, and then you say, go for it. Open up that app's platform and let people start developing, and let them create value, let them co-create value, let them create value in their own right. And this seems to be applicable pretty much to every sort of environment we look at. What we've been saying so far is that if you've got data, if you can link it together, if you can serve it up, you can do a whole lot of analytics and processing, and then you can open it up to everybody else, then it's surprising how much value that you can get back. And we've seen it in the Apple model. There are so many companies looking at this as a way of no longer trying to own the end-to-end process, but facilitating innovation, really focusing on the part they add the greatest value, and then letting things happen. Now, I'll try and give you a few examples of that. It gets a little bit more tricky when we go into the financial services space to try and show some of these cool examples, but I've brought a couple along. This is what we do. So our bread and butter is linking data sets together. We pull in every transaction of every market, everywhere around the world, every day. And what you're looking at here is that data being crunched. There's many, many, many terabytes of data being crunched. We get about 2 million transactions a second, and we just crunch them, we normalize them. We've got data from the ASX, we've got data from the New York Stock Exchange, we've got data from the Kazakhstan sheep futures market. I kid you not. We bring all of those together, we align them from a syntactic perspective, so this thing means a time of sale, this thing means a time of sale, this other stuff somehow gets normalized, and we serve it back up. We sit on several petabytes of data, and one of our favourite customers came to see us recently and said, we'd like a copy of the data. We said, sure thing. We'll burn it on some hard drives, we'll put it on a plane, we'll send it over to you. We did our calculations, we realised we would fill the hold of a 747 to get this data across to them. We think that's big data, but that's volume and velocity. And what you're looking at here is really all of those markets being crunched and being normalised and served back up. You can actually click on the link in the presentation, you can see this stuff happening in real time. It's very, very cool. But volume and velocity don't cut it. In financial markets, so much has been squeezed out of that financial market, so much has been done in order to run the arms race, get a nanosecond advantage on someone else, that it doesn't cut it. You need to bring something else in. You need to change the parameters of the problem. One of the other things that we do is pull information out of company announcements and then link that information to what's happening with that time series information, and then produce a whole lot of reports which hopefully add value. There's a company announcement, you can click on the company announcement and you can see who the directors are, you can see what other companies those directors operate in, you can look at how they've performed, how their performance is in other companies, and you can do a whole lot of things in wetware. You can gain insight far beyond just that tick information about what's happening inside a company. And that's interesting as well. And there's things you can do to start the automating process, to look for events, to look at things that are happening, looking at things that shouldn't have a correlation but do have a correlation. But one of the interesting things we started looking at is sentiment analysis. So we've got all this information, we've got a company announcement that comes out, you can dig in and do your own research. But how does everybody else feel about that company or that announcement when it comes out? And there are so many sources of social media, there are so many sources of people just offering their opinions about things, that it's possible to distill something really interesting about what's just about to happen, what is happening, or what has just happened, beyond all of the fairly dry metrics of this is the bid ask, this is the sell price, this is the board of directors. You can start to get some really powerful insights out of linking other data sets together. Another example, we serve up all of this information, all this time series information, and we said to people, just go for it, go hack, go create something on top of it. And interesting, what we got out was something which we call Unveil. Again, you can click on the link and see how this works. And this is a way of viewing, in this case, way of viewing the stock market, but in this case, it's a way of viewing the entire Dow Jones Industrial Index constituents and how they're performing. And we created this little demo which allows you to look at the whole portfolio and how they're performing, in this case, in terms of either yield or price earnings ratios, return on investment, market capitalisation, all together at the same time. And what's really cool is you can fly down one of these canyons and get a feeling for the portfolio. Or you can walk around on the street of this environment, this index, and get a feeling for what's happening at street level. It's a really interesting way to get a different perspective. We're not quite sure how to monetize this yet, but we think it's pretty interesting. What's really amazing though is you can take this little slider down the bottom and look at that all the way back from where we are right now, all the way back to 1996, and see how that's performed, how that portfolio has performed, in this case, tick by tick, second by second, microsecond by microsecond, all the way back to 1996. And it gives you a really different perspective on a portfolio of things that you're looking at. But then the most powerful stuff comes from predicting. And in the financial services space, there's a lot of research that needs to be done. There's a research alliance, Monash University, CSIRO, Warwick University in the UK, a group of other universities are looking at really what happens with the interaction between superannuation and the economy and people over 60. And really trying to answer some pretty fundamental questions. What are the optimal forms of asset allocation by super funds? It's a big question. How will this impact on economic growth as the pools under management grows ever larger? We're currently approaching the GDP worth of funds under management by superannuation. We have pretty poor knowledge of these two particular questions, especially considering that our population is ageing, especially considering that we've got different rules about partial pensions, especially because we've got real lack of clarity around asset classes like infrastructure, which are unlisted, and have a really different risk-reward profile associated with them. The data sets these guys are looking at are pretty interesting ones, and they go well beyond just the data sets that you would typically have access to from financial markets. So Department of Human Services data provide access to confidentialised information about the individuals and how they're interacting and how they're ageing and how they're going. There are records from the Financial Services Council. Equip Super, who's one of the partners, is providing de-identified information, and there's the Mercer database with records of their own memberships. There are a few other data sets which the group are trying to get access to, which would really crack the nut. But the bottom line is, if they had really the most valuable data sets, they'd have much, much greater insight. Every data set around that provides insight. Every data set around that provides less insight, but still something useful. And the fundamental questions they're looking at are enabling a wider choice of asset classes for investment, responding to the challenge of self-managed super funds, making retirement income and insurance products more attractive, and ultimately looking at the impact of these sorts of investments on the economy. The work's only been going for a little while. First results have been coming out, but there's a couple of basic premise issues here. One is, if you've got data, you can do some really powerful things. You could ultimately build investment products or products for individuals based on actual knowledge of what's happening in the market as opposed to assumed knowledge in the market. It's really amazing how poor quality data people are working on when they're building products, when they're offering something that they think is the right thing for a person approaching retirement, when they think this is actually how the economy works, not just the market works, not just the model that they've got for the individual retiree or the model they've got for the person who's approaching retirement. And that person's view about retirement is something which is changing quite dramatically because the rules about retirement are changing quite dramatically. A lot of work to be done in this space, but the basic premise is exactly the same. Get the data, link it, model it, analyse it, optimise it, create insight, create value. So I'm going to finish with something on timeframes. We've been as a species, as a civilization, since the Industrial Revolution, we've had some pretty big waves of real change, of real fundamental drivers for the economy. We had water, which is pretty impressive. We had steam, really impressive. Electrification, everybody thought that the latest vacuum cleaner or washing machine was the next best thing. That's great. Mass production saved us after the Second World War. And then information and communications technologies. And we're starting to see a really substantial change in companies like Apple and certainly Nokia. They're no longer kings of the castle. Apple's still there, but there's a lot of companies who've really started to slide in terms of their absolute pinnacle position in the market in ICT. And when you look at what's happened in the stock market over the years, there's a broadly speaking correlating trend where new technologies comes in, it goes through a period of creating real wealth and then starts to peter out. And we've just been through, or just coming out of, a pretty significant global financial crisis. And I put it to you that just maybe, we're about to go through another big uplift where there's some new technology, possibly data and analytics, which will allow us to create enormous value. I'll go one step further than that. I will say right now that data and analytics seem to be applicable to every problem facing our economy, facing our country, facing our planet, and potentially even the universe. There is enormous value to be unlocked by bringing data back to information and applying some pretty serious analytics to that, which allow us to create substantial value. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.